Hello, everyone. My name is Said Adashev. I will introduce our next speakers in the section Suicide Risk Among LGBT Individuals. As you have probably noticed this year in our conference, we wanted to focus also on the topic of suicide among LGBT community. And this time we wanted to gain lived experience perspective on this topic. So I feel very grateful that we have some amazing guests, as you will see. First, we will hear Martina McGrath, a PhD student from the University of Melbourne, Australia. Martina is founding co-chair of International Association of Suicide Prevention LGBTQA+ special interest group. She's also a lived experience researcher, and also she created a suicide attempters survivor support group. So without further ado, Martina, welcome. Oh, and also, dear participants, please be active in your questions. At the end of this section, we will have a discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for welcoming me. It's an absolute delight to be with you today. It's Brisbane time. It's about 7 o'clock in the evening here, so it's been a typical Brisbane day. Queensland is known for being subtropical, and it's turned it on today in terms of being quite humid and warm. But I'm really delighted to be here with you to talk about suicide risks for LGBT people. And as has been said, I will be talking to you really from a very lived experience perspective. And I thought for my presentation, I would focus on a particular point in our Australian history when significant social change came to be for LGBT people, and that was when marriage equality and same-sex marriage was legalised here in December of 2017. Before I get into my presentation, you'll see that on the left-hand side of my screen, I've got a particular flag there, and that's one of the many pride flags that exists around the world. The original pride flag was designed back in 1978 by Gilbert Baker in the United States. And as I said, there are many variations on the pride flag that exist today. I chose the Pride Progress flag, and I do tend to use this a little bit. It was designed more recently in 2018 by a graphic designer in America. And what he's done is included a chevron that you can see on the left-hand side of the flag. And really it's to show that for LGBTI people and our rights to equality, but most importantly, our right to health and wellness, there is still progress that needs to be made. And the chevron on the left also highlights for underneath the broad umbrella of LGBT communities, there is not one community, there's multiple and many communities. Certain groups within the broader umbrella need even more attention and assistance in terms of health outcomes. And so the white and the pink and the blue represent transgender and those who are gender fluid, non-conforming people, and the brown and black is to indicate people of colour from the LGBTI community who we still need to really advance their health and wellness, and as we continue our strive for equality. So I'd just like to make a few acknowledgements before I get into the main part of my presentation today. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Meningi, the Brisbane lands of where I'm coming from in my home today. And this is the lands of the Turrbal and the Jagger people. And on the slide, you can see a photograph I actually took very close to where I live in the inner city of Brisbane, looking down the Brisbane River with the central business district over the other side of the river. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge everyone joining today who may have a lived experience of suicide, and that's lots and lots of us. And for us here in Australia, we define a lived experience of suicide by saying it's somebody who perhaps has experienced suicidal distress, so been in extreme emotional pain, somebody who may have experienced a suicide attempt or made attempts. It also includes people who are caring for someone through a suicidal crisis or have cared for someone through a suicidal crisis. And importantly, it also includes people who have lost someone to suicide, so they are bereaved. So it's in all of their honours that I'm delighted to have been asked to be here today, because it is through the work of lived experience activists that we continue to walk alongside many people in the healthcare sector and beyond that are making our lives better. So thank you for inviting me to speak. And the last acknowledgement I'd like to make is to anyone who's attending today who might identify as being a member of the LGBT community. But I'd also extend that to all of our loved ones, to our colleagues and our many allies, because we are many and we are better when we are connected. So just to let you know, I see you and I'm glad to be here with you today. So just by way of a little agenda in terms of where I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey through this presentation. As I said, I'll talk about the 2017 introduction of same-sex marriage that was passed here in Australia, and really hone in on what the process that was used, which was a national postal survey, and what were the mental health and suicide impacts on LGBTI people. And I would argue that the impacts were most definitely felt, as the evidence and the research shows, for LGBTI people, but it rippled across all of Australian society because it was in the public domain and such a hotly discussed topic for a number of months. So we'll take a look back and see what we can learn from the past. I will also introduce some research studies which I think can really highlight some learnings for those as we strive for more equality and in terms of LGBTI rights, but what are the impacts in terms of mental health and suicide related outcomes. I'll share with you just one personal anecdote from that time back in late 2017, what that period in time actually felt like for me, and I'll share that story because I know it's a story that's quite common amongst many of my LGBT friends and colleagues. The fallout of what was that time was like for us. I'll then we'll see what we can learn from the 3 research studies that I will share with you today, and wrap up by saying, well, where to from here? So you can see on your screen now a picture of the most wonderful Great Ocean Road, which is down here in Australia in Victoria, and it's a very well-known tourist destination, both for those of us who live in Australia, but people who come from overseas. And I've chosen that image because I think it reflects in a way where we are in terms of LGBTI social change and our strives for equality and health equity, and that is much like all of social change, but definitely was the case for what happened in 2017 around the postal survey. It was glorious and stunning to look at times, but it had its share of twists and turns. And also, I'd argue that, like all social change, and as we strive for more equality, there are still unseen challenges around new corners, and we need to explore those, and we need to keep driving around those new corners, and so we can all achieve really good health outcomes and live full lives. Before I go on and talk about that particular point in time, and I will share with you a video about when the law was actually passed in Parliament here in Australia, I just want to re-emphasise that I am just one lived experience person here speaking with you today. I can't ever pretend that I speak on everyone's behalf, and same goes for me being a queer person. I come to you just from one person's perspective, but I hope it connects and that we can collaborate as we move forward. So I remember the second half of 2017 incredibly well. I remember it with relief and fondness, but I also know it took an incredible toll. I know it was a time that's also filled with pain and loss. LGBTI people, during the time that the National Postal Survey was open, felt incredibly under the microscope. It was a challenging time. And so I believe that, like all social movements, it came at a particularly high cost. And I'll argue that I think that there are more humane and kinder ways to bring about the same kind of change that we did achieve ultimately here in Australia. But I don't want to take away completely from that time, because it is a moment in history, and it has marked an important change for LGBTI people in terms of our equality. So I'd just like to rewind and take you back to that particular moment in time when Australia said yes. And before I do so, I'll just share with you a couple of quotes that came out around that time, which have really stayed with me. And this first quote you can see is by the then deputy leader, Tanya Plibersek, who just sums it up beautifully, that by the end of today, Australia will be a kinder and fairer place for all of us. And the second quote you can see is by, she's actually a very well-known Australian LGBTI advocate and a mother of a gay son. And again, she just says it perfectly and says, I don't care if he ever gets married, I just want him to have the right. And again, I think that just sums it up perfectly. And the image I've used on the slide is really just for all of us just to remember to keep our hearts and our minds open, that change is possible, and we do that by collaborating and working together. So I'll just show you now the day that Australia said yes.
Lock the doors. As there are fewer than 5 members on the side for the noes in this division, I declare the question resolved in the affirmative in accordance with Standing Order 127. The names of those members who are in the minority will be recorded in the votes and proceedings. The Clerk.
Third reading, a bill for an act to amend the law relating to the definition of marriage and protect religious freedoms and for related purposes.
That's it. That's it.
have to confess, I still get emotional every time I replay that video because it was a moment of joy. As a self-confessed political tragic, I remember the 7th of December sitting, watching the votes being counted and this debate being held in the highest office of our government on that day. So yes, it was a day of great joy, and you can see just on your screen there a very well-known LGBT politician by the name of Penny Wong, who again, it took a toll on many lives, including those of us in the broader community, but also those who live in the political sphere. So how did this come to pass though? What we know for social change to happen, often looking to what's happening around the world becomes a driver in our own countries. It's a great way to actually strive forward. And so we know that just prior to 2017 for us here in Australia, there were other countries that had been starting to introduce same-sex marriage legislation. And so it became a driver for us here in Australia. So I'll just show you, prior to Australia bringing in marriage equality in 2017, let's have a look at the countries that had done so before Australia. So to date, as of 2021, there are actually 30 countries that have legalised same-sex marriage, and 21 have done so in a similar fashion to the way Australia did, that is, using this a national-wide survey approach to garner support. 7 countries have brought in same-sex marriage through court decisions, and those countries you can see on your screen. And interestingly, you can see also that 2 countries, South Africa and Taiwan, legalised same marriage, but only after high courts had mandated that they do so. Just prior to Australia conducting the National Postal Survey and changing the law in 2017, most recently to us was actually Ireland and the USA, which both happened in 2015, and in 2016, Greenland and Colombia introduced marriage equality. And so, as I said, I think that, you know, these became drivers for us, helping us achieve equality here in Australia. But I now want to have a look at, well, what did we learn from that experience in Australia in terms of what were some of the mental health and suicide-related impacts of how the marriage equality was achieved. So I'll just share with you 3 particular studies. The first one is a study from the United States, which was done in 2015, just after they had introduced same-sex marriage legislation. And then 2 studies that were conducted here in Australia, one during when the postal survey was open, and then one which was conducted longitudinally afterwards. So let's have a look at those studies. So this first study is a US study conducted by Raifman and colleagues in 2017, and they really wanted to have a look at you know, the health and well-being of high school students. On the screen, you can see that they used a particular youth risk behavioural surveillance system instrument. And again, it was a longitudinal study, so over a long period of time from January 1999 right through to December 2015, which is when marriage equality at a federal level was achieved in the United States. You can see there the number of participants they were able to include, and interestingly, you can see that 47 out of the 57 states were only able to be included because those 3 other states didn't actually have that instrument as a measure, so they weren't able to be included. And what the authors did was compared, looked for changes in suicide attempts comparable to the previous 12 months. As you can see on the slide, the most notable findings from this particular study was that the introduction of same-sex marriage policies and legislation was in fact noted associated with about a 7% reduction in the proportion of high school students reporting a suicide attempt compared to, the previous 12 months. And what's important to note, out of those 47 states, many of them had gone ahead and introduced same-sex marriage ahead of it being federally legislated in December 2015. The other finding of note from this particular study is that this effect was most notable amongst adolescents who identified as being from a sexual minority. I'll now just have a look at two studies that were conducted, as I said, closer to home here in Australia. And the first study was conducted very much during when the actual postal survey was being conducted. So this was a study conducted and published in 2020 by Varelli and colleagues, which really looked at minority stress, social supports around the time when the postal survey was open from September of 2017 to 2019. The authors were able to collect data from 1,305 LGBTI adults, and the survey recruitment was done via social media, which is becoming more and more commonplace as a vehicle for doing public recruitment for research projects. And as I said, that the authors were really trying to see what they could learn about what impact and role did the media play in terms of positive and negative effects for mental health outcomes for LGBTI people, and what did participants feel was their perceived level of support around the time that the postal survey was being conducted, and measures around psychological distress. And so on your screen, you can see some of the key findings from this particular study, where the authors noted that the frequent exposure to stigmatising media messages was indeed associated with increased psychological distress among lesbian and gay and bisexual Australians during the Australian marriage survey. And the authors go on to say that this actually just corroborates what was already being highlighted by many in the public health domain, that the postal survey itself and the way it was being done by analysing and having LGBTI under the microscope and letting all of Australia vote on whether LGBTI people should have a right to marry legally, did in fact have a detrimental effect on the well-being, or would in fact have a negative effect on our well-being. And the third important finding, again, which becomes a bit of a theme through the literature, is it highlights that it's actually the how same-sex marriage is introduced that can either be a positive or negative in terms of effects for mental health and suicide-related outcomes. The next study I will share with you is a longitudinal study by Casey and colleagues, conducted published in 2020, and this study they collected data over 4 time periods. The first was to survey participants while the postal survey was open. So as I said, that was during September to November of 2017. The second time they collected the data was just after the postal survey had closed, so in late November of 2017. Their third data collection point was some 3 months after, to see what were the impacts after the postal survey and same-sex marriage had been legalised here in Australia. And then they went back some 12 months later and captured the fourth and final data sample, just to see, well, in November 2018, what were the impacts for LGBTI people. And you can see on the slide there, as the authors noted, the results demonstrated that there was an association between the public debate regarding LGBTI rights and psychological distress for LGBT people, and between the passage of marriage equality legislation and the impacts for improved mental health outcomes. Down the bottom of the slide, I've just highlighted a public policy statement that's worth noting for other countries in terms of a learning. So just highlighting and reiterating that a constant exposure to campaigns and to deny marriage rights to lesbian and gays are in fact associated with greater psychological distress for our community, for the queer community. And the longitudinal study, considered the case of Australia and the passing of legislation and a public manner did in fact have some detrimental effects. So it's worth noting those authors' words of caution, for want of a better word. So in terms of what we can learn from those three studies, I think that there's some key and common themes across those studies, both the one from the US and the two that I've shared with you from here in Australia. Firstly, that absolutely marriage equality is a good thing for the health and well-being of LGBTI people. It absolutely has been transformative. I know many of my friends and colleagues who took up their legal right and have gone on to have their partnership and their marriage recognised now under Australian law, which gives them the same rights that marriage of non-LGBTI people have. But we also know, as I've mentioned throughout my presentation, it's the how it's done that matters. So there are, I would argue, more humane and kinder ways to bring about marriage equality, other than a national survey where every person gets to have a say about whether I have the right to legally marry who I love. And as all of these studies have highlighted, and public health concerns and had said time and time again, if whenever there is this public debate and any country is considering, or any jurisdiction is considering introducing same-sex marriage, then there needs to be due consideration given to what kind of informal and formal supports will need to be ramped up to support LGBTI people and their loved ones, and what role can the public play, and what role can and should the media play in terms of being a protective barrier and buffers against the very, very, very real public and at times agonising scrutinisation of LGBTI lives that was going on at this time. As I mentioned, I thought I'd share with you also a personal anecdote, because I think it is just one story, but I actually know that it's a story that was played out for many of my friends and colleagues from the queer community who had similar experiences. So while all of this was happening in the second half in 2017, and it was in the media and everyone was talking about it, you couldn't get away from it being a topic of conversation. It was a hot button topic, and so it damaged relationships, damaged the mental well-being of us as LGBTI people, but it also damaged, I think, the connectivity of Australian society. For me personally, for example, I had a very close friend who we actually had a falling out during that period, because her religious beliefs were that she just couldn't see why LGBTI people should have same-sex marriage equality. I remember her one line at one point to me was, "Why can't you just settle for being friends? Why do you need the law change for you just to be friends?" And I was kind of dumbfounded, and it kind of really highlighted for me that no matter how we tried to negotiate the conversation, she was probably never going to get it. Her religious views were so different and polarized to mine that she probably wasn't ever going to get it. And it was a sad time, because I'd spent time in this friend's house at holiday seasons with her husband and her children. And as I say, I share it with you because I know that my experience was not. It was not uncommon. There were fracturing of many relationships across friendships and colleagues, because it was all being played out so publicly in the media. And the eggs you can see on the basket there, that's probably the myriad of emotions I felt and experienced throughout the latter half of 2017, when marriage equality was being achieved here in Australia. A range of emotions from joy and happiness right through to sadness and confusion. So where to from here? So I guess just as I start to come to the close of my presentation, I'd ask you to dream big and to know that there is still more we need to do for LGBTI people in terms of equality, but in terms of our social equity, our economic equity, and our health and well-being. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, if you aren't from the LGBT community, that's entirely fine, but please be an ally and a friend and supporter, because when it comes to the crunch and we are striving for social change and social equity in our own countries, we will need you by our side to walk that journey and to do it in a kind and humane and compassionate way. And I'll share with you a quote from a very well-known gay LGBT activist and politician, and I think Harvey Milk sums it up perfectly when he says, it takes no survey to remove repression. It takes no compromise to give people their rights. It even takes no money to respect the individuals. And so I hope that we can just keep that in mind as we strive on for more social change. I'm all about staying connected. I think we do more when we continue to connect and continue to have bold and brave conversations. And we do that even when they're robust conversations. So on the screen, you can see my contact details. I encourage you to get in touch and stay connected and continue the conversation. As was mentioned at the beginning, I'm delighted to be one of the founding co-chairs of a very new IAS special interest group, where we are focusing on LGBTI suicide and research, and in particular, what more can we learn, and what best practice research is there out there that we can start to highlight, and even start collaborating on looking at, well, what's the role of things like protective factors and resilience, because we know that LGBTI people, just because we have been so marginalised and discriminated, we are actually quite a resilient group of people. So if you have any interest, please hop onto the International Association of Suicide Prevention's website and check out the Special Interest Groups page there. And I look forward to connecting with you more going forward. Thank you very, very much for your time today.
Thank you, dear Martina, for really thought-provoking presentation. Stay tuned. Toliau mes turėsime pokalbį su.
Now we will have the conversation with the Lithuanian LGBT community representatives, and I am delighted that some of them have agreed to share their experience, their experiences lived. Dominikas Vaitiekūnas, probably you don't have to, we don't have to introduce him to us. And Tovaldas Kiburys, a volunteer. And this year, in order to hear the lived experiences, we were discussing who would we like to invite, and it wasn't difficult. We had heard that Dominika had publicized a letter, sharing letter on experience in the public media, and Dominikas will speak to us at this conference. And Tovaldas had helped for many years other people while working as a volunteer. And I would like to thank you for your courage to speak and for the willingness to contribute to this discussion. Some technical information. At first, you will hear the discussion by Dominikas and Tovaldas in Lithuanian, and then Martina will join. And you might have to want and switch between Lithuanian and English, and you are invited to actively write questions to the discussion participants, because the three of them, Martina, Dominikas, and Tovaldas, will try and answer them. Without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Dominikas and Tovaldas. Hello. Probably we no longer need the headset, because we have heard Martina's presentation, and I see that there is quite an audience. Tovaldi, what do you feel like? Well, I am a bit concerned. Do you often share your experience lived? No, not really. It's quite rare, because it has been approximately a decade since I have had some very sensitive experiences. Well, you have it, right? Well, actually, my experiences are very live, and especially this year. Thank you, Said, for the presentation. And this year, in the LGBT community, these questions were very sensitive, because there was so much negative information on the internet. We have not said anything with Tovaldas, that we have not prepared any slides. That will be our experiences lived, and we will wait for your questions. Before the conference, we had discussed what we would like to share to you, what would be interesting for you. And we have decided to share our experience in the way of improvised conversation, and to cover two important stages. One was the teenage period, when both Tovaldas and myself had very difficult feelings, and it's important for us to speak about that. Another stage is the way towards accepting yourself, and the search for feeling better. So before we start speaking about teenage years and the first experiences, which really intrigue people very much, a brief question to Tovaldas: how do you feel in Lithuania being part of the LGBT community, and especially when speaking that you are transgender? Well, I feel okay today. There are some things which could be better. When speaking about transgender medical and hormone therapy, medical help, but regarding the documents, changing the documents and the operations, it's difficult. Well, I am used to hearing in Lithuania that things are always bad, so it's not bad. Well, there are also good things. Emotionally, I feel quite okay, because I feel that I can live the life which I like today. Maybe you could share your experience. Well, I'm glad to hear that. My experience is the following. I used to always think that it's much more difficult for transgender people in Lithuania than to me. But probably it's very difficult. It's stupid to compare your experience with mine or mine with others. What do I feel like? I feel that I have a bubble around me, a bubble of safety, and I am used to ignoring information and pretending that it doesn't exist. This year it was extremely difficult to do that, and I probably catch myself about thinking about the problems in the public media, that it's like a movie on the TV screen which doesn't impact me. It is my protective strategy in order for me not to hear the negative information, not to get identified with it, because it's very difficult to live in Lithuania in the reality which we have today. And I remember that in the spring when there was this family march, very active, and I have a studio near the president's office, and I see people with posters at the president's office, and I was walking my dog, and I walk by and I see that poster which says "disappear from here," and I felt that not good. It's not good, and I realized that this is not about me. This is about others. And then on the same day, I received a message from someone I know, a young guy from another city, because he started having back the suicidal ideation, because he feels that whatever environment he has around him, he goes on the internet and he sees all those negative feeds, Instagram, Facebook, all of them containing the negative information that in this Lithuania, he doesn't feel safe and full living. And then I returned back to the other reality and really felt difficult. I had a difficult day when in the center of VILNIUS I had to do a lot of work, and the roads were blocked because the family march participants had planned to storm the parliament, and I actually had to walk among those people, and I felt really sad. Regarding my first encounters, I remember it used to be much more difficult those 20 years ago, when for the first time I started thinking about what is happening to me. I will share my experience, but I am interested in your experience. You wasn't born in a large city, you were born in the province. Actually, I grew up in a very remote rural area without civilization, without hot water, without a toilet, and we used to heat our water on the stove, and the water in the well, the toilet, which was the dry toilet outside. So what thoughts did you have back then? How did you feel about your identity? In my childhood, before school, I felt okay because nobody treated me differently. I had friends and games and everything seemed fine. We were three kids in the family, two boys and me, and I was treated as a girl, and nobody thought that there's a problem because we would share clothing, and I would be treated as a girl. But then at school, children noticed that I got dressed as a boy, and up until the 10th year in the school, I used to feel that I would be bullied. I knew what to expect at school, and I used to be pushed and offended and bullied for 10 years at school. Then I felt really bad. And around when I was 15 or 16 years old, I started realizing my identity, but I didn't know what it was called because there was not much information about that. And I felt that I was being misunderstood, and nobody understood me. And coming to the climax of my life, I had even had done suicide attempts, and I was the constant youth line interlocutor for 2 years. I used to call the youth helpline, and I would tell them that I had suicidal ideation, I didn't feel well, and I was invited one day I was offered psychological help that day. At that time, I didn't accept the offer because I had some prejudices. I was scared. I thought that psychological help is only for those who are mad. At that time, I thought so. It was true. But then I accepted the offer. There were certain nuances regarding the children's rights and the cooperation between the Children's Rights Protection Agency and the school. I was 15, 16 years old. So actually, I received psychological help, and the first psychologist did not suit me. Then Paulus helped me find another one. And when I was in my 10th school year, I decided that I need to run away from the countryside, and I came back. I came here to Vilnius, and this was another stage of my life. Okay, my story up until I came to Vilnius was the following. I grew up in another city, Panevėžys, a province, and to me it looked the mistake of my life, that I should have grown up in such a grey post-Soviet sad media. I grew up in a Soviet apartment block, which was received by my grandfather, who died when I was a child. In my environment, we didn't have the word gay. It was a different one. It's a swear word. Queer, someone very bad. And when as a child, I didn't actually know what that swear word meant. And our family had an acquaintance too, with a family with 2 children. The man had a wife, and I remember my mom saying that they came up, and she dropped in one day, and she found him actually sleeping with a man. And it was a disaster, and it was an awful label that this man had a relationship with another man. And of course, I thought that this will never happen to me, because these awful things happen for a reason. And back then, I'm now 24 years old, and back then it was over 20 years ago, and there was no internet. And I remember later on from my teenage years about what the image of a homosexual man was. It was something very vulgar, someone who going on certain platforms and demonstrating nudity, and which via some TV3 channel or another channel used to be shown as something really vulgar. So this was the image, something really bad and vulgar and ununderstandable and remote, and for which your environment can really condemn you. And I was 12 or 13 years old, and there was the TV channel TV 1000, and approximately at 11 o'clock they used to start showing some erotic programs or films. And the first time in my life I felt that when watching those views, I feel something wrong. I was a teenager and I didn't understand what it was, what was strange about that. And I used to realize that their bodies, the men's bodies were attractive. But it was just a slight confusion. I started uh, getting suspicions about myself, and I promised to myself that I will not start speaking about that, because if I do, it will be really bad. And I was in the 9th grade when I started having that strange feeling to have some romantic dreams or communicating. And I remember that on the TV screen line, I saw the running line that a young man would like to meet a young man in Panevėžys. And I had a phone and I sent a message, and we had to meet somewhere in town to have a cup of coffee or tea. And I came and I stood further away from the meeting point, and I saw the man coming and I ran away because I was so much scared. What am I doing here? What tragedy I am committing? And I was in the 10th grade and I was at a party, a New Year party. And with a female friend and her boyfriend, we were smoking in the balcony, and the female friend left, and it was raining over the glass. It was a terrace balcony, and I felt something really strange. I felt I want to speak to that man so much. And when we returned with that, my female friend's boyfriend, back to the room where there was a party, and in a couple of weeks of correspondence, what happened? That my female friend's boyfriend left the female friend and started having a relationship with me. And I felt that this is a very strong emotional attraction. You cannot resist it. You cannot do anything about it. I tried to do something. I tried to convince me that this was temporary, that these are teenage confusions and they will pass and my life will become brighter. At the same time, I started feeling guilt, the sense of guilt, because we never did something more than walking or meeting and playing with the snow and walking in the park and dreaming about our future. And but the relationship was so strong and so nice, and it was really my first love. And I was scared that this was happening, and I was so much ashamed that I feel these things, then the sense of guilt that I feel that. And because the image from my childhood was that having romantic feelings towards a man is really bad, I felt that I will bring the unfame and shame to my family. And then I got scared. I was in constant fear. I started thinking what and who sees me and how they see me. And what I look like to others, whether others know something about that. I used to avoid my boyfriend publicly, and if we would meet, it would be in a remote place or a cafeteria where there's a very small likelihood to meet someone we know. And I used to tend to intellectualize things. I used to attend a good school, and it was very important for me to find explanations why it was happening, why to find the causal link, and to put everything in order, because if you cannot find an explanation, you cannot exist. And my whole body, soul, and mind told me that what I was doing was illegal, and I got frustrated internally, constantly. I sometimes experience that feeling even now. It was not that awful, but it's the same like you have to do 15 jobs at a time and you do not manage, and then you start feeling the guilt that you do not manage it, and it's a constant condition, because when you are thinking about 100 things at a time, it's very difficult to learn productively, to make use of your time effectively, and you always live in the fear that you will fail. And then I started thinking that I do not want to feel what I was feeling, do not think about what I was thinking, because I couldn't bear it anymore. And I had the dream to disappear, to dissolve like a smoke, and not to cause the threat to the environment anymore, and not to feel the feelings that I was feeling at that time. And I never thought about suicide directly at that time, because suicide was the very marginal thing that I could have committed, and even less legal, because I had lived in a family which had experienced suicide. My grandmother committed suicide. She had um, committed suicide when I was a child, and from my childhood, I had seen the drama of a close person who my grandmother got drowned, and I had experienced that drama, and from my childhood, I knew it was a huge tragedy, and there can be no bigger tragedy. So suicide was an awfully illegal thing. So I don't know whether I didn't feel that, didn't have the suicidal ideation because I didn't allow that to myself, or whether I didn't have the suicidal crisis, because in my environment we have the group of informal people, mostly these were female friends, got friends, and we did not speak a lot about that, because we did not feel safe. We had a group of punks and goths, and female friends used to have a relationship with each other, and in that group we had the feeling of torture, that it and these young ladies would cut their arms, would inflict harm on themselves, and when they would take the razor blade and cut their arm, then blood starts dripping, and at that moment you stop thinking about your existence on the earth, you start thinking about pain, and this moment was terrible for me, and I saw one way out. One option would be accept myself, admit that I was attracted by men, although I did have experience with females, but of course, having relationships with females was never illegal, but having a relationship with a male was either accepting it or running away or waiting. And accepting it seemed a huge tragedy to me and a huge challenge, because you would ruin the world of your surrounding environment and your own as well, and you would be socially excluded, and that would be social suicide. And I chose another option, running away, waiting till it passes, because I thought that it will pass after my teenage years. And I went to Vilnius, and I entered the musical and theater academy, and now let us go back to you, Valdas. What is your experience? You ran away from your village when you were in your 10th school year. Yes. And you may ask questions, by the way, if you want, because you will be looking to your questions. Told us. Well, my escape probably looked dramatic to me. Many misunderstood me because I was a good student, and they were forecasting that I will graduate very well if I continue school and will enter university. So I decided to graduate, and after 10 years, go to Vilnius and enter the vocational school. At that time, I had not yet changed my documents, and I entered the school as a lady, as a girl, and I was the only female representative in the group, because I chose the profession of the vehicle mechanical engineer. And Vilnius was the breakthrough in my life, because things started changing. I really enjoyed what I was studying, what I was doing. At that time, nobody knew who I was, and I told nobody. In Vilnius, I found the information that there's the LGBT communities psychotherapeutic group. So the breakthrough was for the better or for the worse? For the better, of course. The worse, there was some bullying, but not at the level as I had in the village. So I actually started attending this mental health support group, and it was my second life. I came as Torvalds to that group, and I was accepted by the group, and I attended it for a year, and I accepted myself too. I started feeling better, and in my personal environment, I started feeling better, and bit by bit, it became better. How did your family react? As far as I know about you, your environment and your grandmother supported you, right? Well, my family supported me from my very first days of my life, and I am very thankful to my mom and grandmother. It was a bit more difficult with my brother and father, but with time passing by, it settled. And every year, my grandmother, at every more difficult situation, even in the rural school, my grandmother would support me. Of course, there were certain issues. For instance, I sometimes did not even manage to tell my grandmother that I was bullied at school, because my grandmother was tired of that. Every time when there was some beating at school, for instance, my grandmother would come to school and would speak to everyone, and then it would settle for the moment, but then again and again. So sometimes I knew that I couldn't change it, so I would just accept that. Were there any situations when you felt that there was no way out and you just have to be with that? Yes. And from that being with yourself, you start getting a thicker skin. But there are feelings that get accumulated, and some can release that steam, but others can't. When was the moment when you decided you need to get help? For instance, helpline, calling the helpline. Well, I had known about I had known that that there is this helpline, but I didn't know that this was not only for mad people but others as well. And if I had not received the help, then I would have probably now be dead. And actually, there was a stage in my life when I had attempted suicide. At that moment, when I felt that, I actually did not care about what others think and what my grandmother will say. I didn't care. I actually tried to choke myself. What do you mean? Physically, with a pillow? I will not be now speaking about the way to commit suicide publicly, but I felt that I was actually moving forward somewhere, and I felt that I needed to finish everything. And is it in the figurative sense? No, it's in the direct sense. I really tried to commit suicide, and after I saved myself, I started viewing life in a different way. And now, because inflicting self-harm and suicide went hand in hand for me, when I was inflicting harm on myself, I can say that now I can say that this doesn't solve your problem, and the scars remain there for the whole of your life. What else can I say? Maybe you would like to add something. I'm so sorry if this was a very politically incorrect question. I wanted to know whether you were discussing about the figurative way or the direct sense of the word. I actually would inflict harm on myself in the figurative way. I was stuck in a sudden loop without another way out, and I did not actually think of seeking help, and you did, and you got that help in due time. In my case, actually, I grew up with a violent mother, emotionally violent mother, and my parents were alcohol dependent. So I actually had a whole set of factors that did not help me. And there was one tool that really helped me. And my parents actually started attending group therapy and started getting out of that. And in this way, I would find out about group therapy and would attend a group as an individual, a child of an alcoholic parent, and having some damage caused to me. But because I was LGBT, at this group therapy, I could never speak about that because that community which I attended at the time was kind of there were certain prejudices and I didn't feel safe. And when I left for Vilnius, I thought that I don't have to do anything about that. And for 2 or 3 years, I was trying to dissuade myself from being the way I was. And I still tend to be workaholic and to have many activities. And I used to be very active all the time. And actually, I would make myself busy with the rehearsals, a lot of work, and so on. And I was always occupied, and I started having insomnia, maybe because of that, and feelings of anxiety. And I started feeling constant anxiety and fear. And at that time, I must have found assistance with a new group of people. I started singing in the choir of Christian music, Sounds and G, and I would sing gospel there, and I liked the conductor, the manager, and I thought that, well, being LGBT and being Christian, it doesn't match, doesn't go hand in hand. But then I heard some jokes there. If you are a tenor and if you come to this choir, we will make you gay, because everybody who comes to this choir being a tenor, they leave being gay. And I really felt I liked that humor. And then I thought that I need to prove yes or no. And some of that Christian group started inviting me in parties, and I started participating there, and I heard that they were attending gay clubs, Christians. Can you imagine that? And I somewhat felt scared, and well, I said, no, 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 I won't go there. Come on, they are vulgar, there are orgies, and no, no, I don't need that. Bit by bit, step by step, and it lasted a year or a year and a half, that this group of people made me feel safe. Probably they felt that I was not speaking about certain parts of my life. And I was in an open relationship with a female girl at that time, because she kind of pushed me. At that time, she pushed me, said, well, go and try with boys. And I opened up to her, and it was the moment of acceptance, although it was very difficult. But I started feeling that, well, maybe the image that I had from my childhood does not actually match the reality. Maybe there are other options. And in due course, I started watching movies, going to documentary movie festivals, communicating with people and LGBT members. And I saw different models, different examples. And I thought that, well, if I ever fall in love with a male, that will be a sign that it has not passed and will not. And it happened. And I realized that probably I used to feel more attraction, more emotional affection towards males, more romantic feelings. And I decided that it was time I accepted myself. So I actually confronted myself, being 24 or 25, after a decade of frustrations and constant attempts to resist. So my path lasted, my way lasted, my period of accepting myself lasted for another 4 or 5 years till I became 29. And then I openly, publicly opened up, although I was bullied that if somebody finds out, makes a picture, you will lose your job. So I went through all that process, which was probably important, but there's no more time to be telling about that. And we have 5 more minutes. Maybe let's get the questions. And it would be nice if people asked you questions, and I will ask one. The moment of acceptance, was it at the breakthrough in the relationship with yourself? Oh, yes. I was scared of myself, scared of the unknown, what will be there when I accept myself. What will I do? My situation was I'm not only transgender, this is related to emotional things, but also physical things like surgeries and hormone therapy. And I was scared what will happen. But I managed to do that, not overnight. It was a long process. But I don't remember very clearly, but it must have taken 2 or 3 years. And when I accepted myself, it became easier. And it was in the fighting mode when I needed to start to fight for myself in order to achieve what I want. And it was first the surgery, then document change, then the hormone therapy. I don't know whether I should expand. And was it a partial surgery? And well, at the moment it's only partial. I did not do the full surgery because I'm waiting for the technologies to improve.
These 2 years, you said that you needed 2 or 3 years for acceptance. Did you experience some feelings of wanting to come back to your initial state? No, my emotional state was getting better. I stopped inflicting self-harm on me, and I started to feel better. And do you now have any conflicting moments with acceptance of yourself? For example, you would do something differently in this process. Do you have that kind of thoughts? I'm trying not to get back with my thoughts. I would not like to go back to the previous times and to the previous states. I don't think about that. And all these things were 10 years ago, and I don't remember many of the details, but I do remember the emotions and the very strong feelings. Today, I am happy. I have reached my goals. Sure, I have more goals and I have more space to improve, but today I don't have any suicidal thoughts. Do you sometimes want to leave Lithuania? Yes, sometimes. When? There are different reasons. Sometimes I would think about emigration into another country because I would have a better health care for transgender people. I would have more possibilities to get a legal treatment with my personal physician. But in Lithuania, as far as I know, we will have it not in the long run. So I stay here. Here I mean the legislation that would regulate the treatment and the hormonal therapy of transgender persons. But this law is yet a draft. Yes, it's a draft. It's not yet approved. So I wish that these laws would be approved in order to be able to stay in Lithuania and to create an environment where everybody would feel safe. I know lots of people and it's a pity. And we speak about that with them. I know very many people, LGBT people, who have emigrated. They are sad, they are angry, and they emigrate for economic reasons, for emotional reasons. But I would like as many of us to stay as possible in order to go on with us with this fight. But also in order to just live in a normal environment, to speak, to be together, to to be with your couple, not to be afraid. I would like to live to a moment where we don't need to tell everybody what is different in being an LGBT person. How much time do we have? Some 10 minutes for questions. We have very many questions. Could you tell me where the LGBT help groups take place? Yes, we have 20 minutes for questions. Very good. So the help groups for LGBT, they could be for parents or for LGBT persons. In the website išgirsti.lt, they are led by the Association Incorpore, as far as I know. It's a human rights association who works with LGBT people. Did you go to this group? No, it was another group. Now there are quite a few help groups and specialists who specialize in this topic. What about your parents? Do you feel supported by parents, and how did they react? Are your parents 100% supportive? Not 100%, maybe, except my father, but he's also accepting. In my case, for my parents, it was my coming out. For my parents was I was 25 when I came out to my parents, and for them, as I know, the road, acceptance road, it's like you pass the ball. It was my way, my road, and then I passed the ball to my parents. In my case, the acceptance period for my parents was 2 years period, and now I think that they have accepted it. And my mother is an activist of LGBT rights, and they have founded Association of LGBT Parents, and this association will work for the better emotional welfare in our society. What would you wish to the psychologist? What are the mistakes when psychologists work with LGBT persons and LGBT youth? Yes, a very good question. What could we do? How should we speak? What should we do? Torvald, do you have any suggestions? No miracles. We don't have any miracles. Tolerance, acceptance. As a transgender person, could you please use the name and the pronoun that I would like to hear? He or she. It's very important. You feel much safer if you are addressed in the correct way. So that's it. Can you add something? In my case, I see that many people think that LGBT people have some like features that you see and you can say this person is an LGBT person. I think that this assumption is very popular, but we should get rid of this assumption because there are no features, no physical features. The only thing is that you feel attraction to the same sex persons. And in the case of Torvald, how would you name the main feature? The transgender and orientation, these two things are very different. Transgender and sexual orientation. It's not the same. And when I think what helped me to feel safer and better, it goes for a psychologist, for a friend, for a teacher, for a social worker. So the first step would be if in your classroom or in your community you have a negative opinion about LGBT and you are a psychologist, a social worker, a parent, a teacher, you don't speak up. So at that point, the LGBT person will think that you are not the one who makes this audience safer. So in order to make it safer, you don't need to make a whole lecture about that, but you would need not to tolerate bad comments. I remember two anecdotes. In one classroom, a Catholic priest came and spoke about the LGBT person that they should be shut down, that they should die. And I could not understand why this teacher did not react. And another anecdote, in another classroom, somebody laughed at gay people, and the teacher said, "Excuse me, how old are you? Are you 5 or 15? If you are 15, why do you laugh at these things?" So these two examples are very different. So my suggestion would be to make an open alliance and to show your points of view. We also have a question for Martina. I think Martina is still with us, and we have a question for her. Martina, could you hear us?
Are you here together with us still? We're calling to Australia. Oh, hi Martin.
Hello.
Hello. I cannot hear you properly.
Let me put my headphones on and see if it helps.
Could you say something, please?
Can you hear me now?
Not so clear, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Ah,
And during your presentation, that was much clearer. Yeah.
okay. I've got the same headphones on, so I'm not sure.
Okay, and translation on the translation, do we have a proper sound? Ar geras garsas, Martin? Ar žmonės ją girdi? Nes aš tai biškį galiu taip įsitempęs ir paklausysiu. Svarbu, kad žmonės girdėtų. Yeah, we're checking our technical stuff, and we have one question from the audience, especially to you. Someone asked, would you say there was a lessening of homophobia and discrimination in Australia after the legalization? legislation. Lessening, maybe. What is
Yeah,
lessening? I don't know what is lessening.
decreasing,
Oh, all right. Yeah, yeah, decreasing. Yeah.
decreasing. I think ultimately yes, but again, there was also what I call a pushback. So whenever social change happens like that, as much as there has been more acceptance and increased social cohesion, there are also some elements of the community that were not happy and are still not happy about the fact that LGBTI people can now marry. And in fact, as we speak, going forward in Australia, there's a bill before Parliament to bring in, it's called a religious discrimination bill. And it really came about after marriage equality was brought in, because it was the churches, some of the religious parties saying, we're not happy about this. We're not happy about LGBTI people, having the right to marry. And so now there's a whole other debate. There's a whole other issue that LGBTI people are once again having to kind of be under the microscope. For example, if this religious discrimination bill gets up, it means that private schools who employ gay teachers can fire them. So whilst there was a decrease, and it has, it was a moment in social history that we needed. And it's certainly been great for LGBTI people in terms of our emotional and health and well-being. There always seems to be something new that then comes on the horizon. There'll be some sectors that just aren't happy with us having equality, and so it has improved. But I think that, if I'm going to be really blunt, I think the world in some respects, and particularly here in Australia, is very conservative, very, very conservative. And so there's almost a pushback again. So I'm really grateful it happened in 2017, but I wonder what's next,
Yes, we all wonder what's next. And I have a question for you. Am I right? Please correct me if I'm wrong. That there was a 7% of suicidal cases after the marriage equality in Australia. Am I right?
That was the US. So that was in the
US,
United
right.
States. Yeah. In the United States in 2015, when same-sex marriage was legalized at the end of the year in 2015, what the authors noted, they conducted that research study, and that for some of the states brought in marriage equality before it was done at a federal, national level. And so they were able to see that for young people, where the states had gone ahead and brought in same-sex marriage ahead of it being done at a federal level, there was definitely a 7% decrease in suicidality for young people. So it is absolutely imperative that that we get our rights, including for young people.
Thank you for your answer. There is another question for Martina. Question for Martina from Paulus. Was there any flashback from society against the same-sex legislation? How did mental health specialists help in this?
I think that one of the enormously, but I think one of the key learnings is to actually listen to the public health professionals before. They were saying before this all was played out in the second half of 2017, you need to ramp up the mental health and suicide prevention supports, because if you're going to put LGBTI people under the microscope in a public national campaign, then they need supports around them. And so the lessons from that is the next time we face the next challenge is that we do really heed that advice, and so we ramp up services. And when I say services, I mean formal services, so clinical services, yes, not-for-profit services, telephone services, whatever it may be, but also what are the informal supports around people, including our social networks, and how can we all support LGBTI people? I think, you know, just to pick up on Paulus's question, I think one of the learnings is just that very thing. Is it will, the minute there is, I look at this religious discrimination bill, which, as I just mentioned to you, is almost like our next challenge that is in Parliament at the moment. It's having a similar effect in terms of mental health outcomes because again, with the topic of discussion about whether we can work in schools if we're queer in a private school, in a private religious school. So, you know, ramping up support in terms of formal supports, informal supports, and allyship matters, the media matters. So all of that kind of, it's got to be done cohesively.
Thank you for your answer, and probably we'll need to switch in Lithuanian language. Sorry for that,
It's
because we have
okay.
a couple of minutes and a few questions left. Thank you, Martina, for sharing your experience with us. Ir dabar norėčiau Martina dar kažką sakė.
Ir vėl pereikim iš lietuvių kalbos. Ar Martina dar kažką sakė? We had a question. What is your critical resource to accept yourself and to create a good environment for yourself, an accepting environment? I don't know what a critical resource is, what is meant by this, but I could answer what helped. Where did we get the strength to go on? In my case, the understanding that my acceptance is not only about me. There are people around me who need to know the truth. There is also this complication. My relationship with with the people around me is very complicated if I always have to do the censorship of what I say and how I feel and what I do. And it also helped to understand that an LGBT person needs to have at least one person who accepts him and to whom he could open. We usually want LGBT people to come out, to speak, etc. But sometimes it's not yet the correct time to do that. Each person has to choose the moment to open up, to come out. We should not push. So in my case, I came to be independent in the financial, economic terms, and I was responsible for myself, for my life. So many small factors, and my personal wish to change my environment. And what was in your case? What were these critical resources? In my case, very similar. It is sometimes very difficult to remain strong yourself. So it's very important to have at least one person whom you could call and speak to. But if you don't have anyone around you, you have the helpline, emotional helplines. We have one more question. What should people do who cannot accept the orientation of another person? It could be the parents, friends, or whatever. It's more difficult not to accept than to accept, because the not acceptance and the anger, these emotions are much stronger and much worse. So I would wish everybody to accept. And I would wish these people that they would look for other people who would have similar experiences. I have noted that parents, they go through a very big crisis when their child comes out. They feel a very strong push and stress from the outside. So in my opinion, is to look for help. There are different LGBT parent groups. They could go to a specialist and to keep in mind that acceptance is a process. You will not accept in one day or in 5 minutes that I will accept this change or this news. So it's a process. But what we will do in 5 minutes is go to have lunch. We all are hungry. Yes, I agree. So let's go to have lunch. Yes, let's do that. Thank you for your openness. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for watching. Let's go to have lunch and then we will come back to go on with our conference.